At Easter dinner, my cousin smirked and said, "Let's be thankful we're not pathetic like some people at this table." Everyone laughed. I just set down my fork, smiled, and said, "Funny, grandmother didn't think I was pathetic when she left me everything. Good luck finding somewhere else to live." The room fell completely silent. I, 32M, never thought Easter dinner would be the day I'd finally get my revenge on the family that spent years treating me like garbage. But sometimes life gives you the perfect moment, and you'd be stupid not to take it. Growing up, I was always the odd one out. My parents died in a car accident when I was 8, and my grandmother took me in. The rest of the family never let me forget I was the charity case. My cousins, aunts, and uncles made sure I knew I didn't really belong. They'd make jokes about my secondhand clothes, my lack of college fund, how I was just lucky grandmother felt sorry for me. My cousin was the worst of them all. 3 years older, captain of his high school football team, went to an expensive private college on daddy's dime. He never missed a chance to remind everyone how successful he was, how he had his life together, unlike some people. The family ate it up. He was the golden boy, and I was the burden. Grandmother was different, though. She never made me feel unwanted. She'd slip me $20 when no one was looking, help me with homework, made sure I had everything I needed. When I struggled in school, she got me a tutor. When I wanted to learn guitar, she bought me one for my birthday. The family always rolled their eyes at her generosity toward me. After high school, I went to community college and worked nights at a warehouse. It wasn't glamorous, but I was determined to make something of myself. I transferred to a state university, graduated with a business degree, and slowly worked my way up in logistics. Nothing fancy, but I was proud of what I'd built. Meanwhile, my cousin was living it up. He got a job at his father's construction company right out of college, bought a flashy car, moved into a nice apartment. At family gatherings, he'd talk about his latest vacation or expensive purchase while I sat quietly, knowing anything I said would be dismissed. The comments never stopped. At Christmas 2 years ago, he announced he was getting married and joked about how some people would probably die alone. Everyone laughed. Last Thanksgiving, he bought a house and made sure to mention how nice it was to be financially stable, unlike others who were still renting. More laughter. I stopped going to most family events. It was easier than dealing with the constant humiliation. But grandmother always asked me to come, and I couldn't say no to her. She was getting older, frailier, and I knew our time together was limited. Last September, grandmother had a stroke. I was the one who found her when she didn't answer her phone for 2 days. I rode in the ambulance, stayed with her in the hospital, handled all the paperwork. The rest of the family showed up eventually, but I was there from the beginning. She recovered mostly, but she was different. Weaker. She started talking about getting her affairs in order, updating her will. The family suddenly became very interested in spending time with her. My cousin started visiting weekly, bringing flowers, taking her to lunch. His parents did the same. Everyone was being so attentive. I kept visiting like I always had, but now I wasn't alone. There was always someone else there, chatting with grandmother about her house, her investments, her plans. They'd smile at me politely, but make it clear I was interrupting their quality time. Grandmother passed away in January. Peaceful, in her sleep. I was devastated. She was the only person who'd ever truly cared about me, and now she was gone. The funeral was a blur of relatives I barely knew expressing their condolences while calculating their inheritance in their heads. The will reading was scheduled for the following week. I wasn't expecting much, maybe a small keepsake or a few $1,000s. The family was clearly anticipating something bigger. My cousin had already started talking about what he'd do with his inheritance, how he might invest it or use it to expand his house. I sat in the lawyer's office surrounded by my relatives, all of them dressed in their best clothes, trying to look appropriately somber while barely containing their excitement. The lawyer was an older man who'd known grandmother for decades. He opened the folder and began reading. The small bequests came first. A few thousand to various charities, some jewelry to the female relatives, a watch to one of my uncles. Everyone nodded politely, waiting for the real announcements. Then he got to the house. The beautiful Victorian house where grandmother had lived for 40 years, where she'd raised her children, where she'd taken me in when I had nowhere else to go. Everyone leaned forward. He read my name. The room went dead silent. I stared at him, sure I'd misheard. But he continued reading. The house, the property, everything. All mine. But that wasn't all. The investment accounts, the savings, the life insurance policies. Nearly everything went to me. The total value was staggering, over $2 million. I'd gone from scraping by to wealthy in the span of a single sentence. My cousin's face went white. His parents looked like they'd been slapped. The whole room was staring at me in shock and barely concealed rage. The lawyer explained that grandmother had updated her will just 3 months before she died. She'd been very specific about her wishes. She wanted everything to go to the person who'd been there for her consistently, who'd cared for her without expecting anything in return. I walked out of that office in a daze. I was rich. I owned a house. I could quit my job if I wanted to. But more than that, grandmother had seen what the family had done to me all these years, and she'd made sure they knew exactly what she thought of their behavior. The next few months were a whirlwind. I had to deal with probate, insurance companies, financial advisors. I kept working, not sure what else to do with myself. I moved into grandmother's house and slowly made it my own. The family was furious. They contested the will, claiming grandmother wasn't of sound mind when she changed it. But the lawyer had been thorough. He'd had her evaluated by a doctor, documented her mental state, made sure everything was ironclad. The challenge failed. My cousin was hit the hardest. Turns out he'd been counting on that inheritance more than anyone knew. He'd taken out loans against his expected windfall, made investments he couldn't afford. When the money didn't come, he was in serious trouble. I heard through the family grapevine that he'd had to sell his house, move back in with his parents. His wife wasn't happy about the financial situation. His father's construction business was struggling, and without the inheritance to prop it up, they were facing some difficult decisions. I felt a little bad about it, but mostly I felt vindicated. They'd spent years making me feel worthless, and now they were learning what it felt like to struggle. Which brings me to Easter dinner. I almost didn't go. I'd been avoiding family gatherings since the will reading, knowing how awkward it would be. But my aunt called and specifically asked me to come. She said it was important for the family to stay together, especially after losing grandmother. She sounded sincere, so I agreed. I should have known better. I arrived at my uncle's house carrying a bottle of wine and a dessert I'd picked up from an expensive bakery. I could afford the good stuff now, and I figured I might as well enjoy it. The family was already gathered in the living room, making small talk and pretending everything was normal. My cousin was there with his wife, both of them looking strained. He'd lost weight, and there were dark circles under his eyes. His wife barely looked at me when I said hello. The rest of the family was polite but distant. I could feel the tension in the room. Dinner was awkward from the start. Everyone was trying too hard to act normal, but the elephant in the room was impossible to ignore. I'd gone from the family charity case to the richest person at the table, and nobody knew how to handle it. The conversation was stilted, full of forced laughter and uncomfortable silences. I tried to participate, but everything I said seemed to remind everyone of the situation. When I mentioned I was thinking about taking a vacation, the table went quiet. When I complimented the food, my aunt seemed to take it as condescension. I was starting to regret coming when my cousin decided to break the tension in the worst possible way. He'd been drinking steadily throughout dinner, and I could see him getting more agitated as the evening went on. He kept shooting glances at me, his jaw clenched, his hands gripping his fork too tightly. Finally, he couldn't contain himself anymore. He raised his glass and announced that he wanted to make a toast. Everyone looked at him expectantly, hoping he was going to say something nice about grandmother or family unity. Instead, he smirked and said we should all be thankful we weren't pathetic like some people at this table. The words hit me like a physical blow. After everything that had happened, after all the years of their cruelty, he was still trying to humiliate me. And the worst part was that everyone laughed. Not loudly, not enthusiastically, but they laughed. Even after I'd inherited everything, even after grandmother had made her feelings clear, they still saw me as the acceptable target. I sat there for a moment, fork halfway to my mouth, feeling that familiar burning sensation in my chest. The same feeling I'd had at countless family gatherings over the years. The urge to shrink into myself, to take the abuse and pretend it didn't hurt. But something was different this time. I wasn't the powerless kid anymore. I wasn't the struggling young adult scraping by. I was the one with the power now, and I realized I didn't have to take this anymore. I set down my fork carefully, making sure it didn't make a sound against the plate. The table was still chuckling at my cousin's joke, but I could see a few people starting to look uncomfortable. They could sense something was about to happen. I smiled. Not a fake smile, not a nervous smile, but a genuine smile of someone who was about to enjoy themselves immensely. Then I told him it was funny that he thought I was pathetic, considering grandmother hadn't thought so when she left me everything. I suggested he might want to start looking for somewhere else to live, since I'd heard his parents were having some financial difficulties. The laughter died instantly. The room went so quiet I could hear the clock ticking in the kitchen. Everyone was staring at me with their mouths open, forks suspended halfway to their faces. My cousin's face went through several colors before settling on a deep red. His wife put her hand on his arm, trying to calm him down, but he shook her off. He started to say something, probably another insult, but I wasn't finished. I told him I'd heard about his financial troubles, how he'd been so confident about his inheritance that he'd made some poor decisions. I mentioned that I'd been thinking about what to do with all my new wealth, and I was considering some real estate investments. Maybe I'd buy up some properties around town, help out struggling families. The implication was clear. I could buy his parents' house if they defaulted on their mortgage. I could become their landlord. The power dynamic had completely flipped, and everyone at the table knew it. My cousin stood up so fast his chair fell over. He started yelling about how I didn't deserve any of it, how grandmother had been manipulated, how I was a leech who'd taken advantage of an old woman. His wife was trying to get him to sit down, but he was beyond reason. I just sat there, still smiling, letting him rant. Every word he said was making him look worse and making my point for me. The rest of the family was watching in horror as their golden boy had a complete meltdown. Finally, his father told him to stop, that he was embarrassing himself. But my cousin was too far gone. He turned on his father, screaming about how this was all his fault, how he'd promised the inheritance would solve their problems, how they were all going to lose everything. That's when the real family secrets started coming out. Turns out my uncle's construction business was in worse shape than anyone knew. They'd been borrowing money against the expected inheritance for months, making payroll with credit cards, taking on jobs they couldn't afford to complete. My cousin's wife finally had enough. She stood up and announced she was leaving, that she couldn't deal with this anymore. She'd been keeping quiet about their financial problems, but she was tired of pretending everything was fine when they were about to lose their apartment. She looked at me and said she was sorry for how they'd treated me over the years. She said she'd always thought it was wrong, but she'd gone along with it to keep the peace. Now she realized there was no peace to keep. She walked out, and after a moment, my cousin followed her, still muttering about how unfair everything was. The rest of the dinner was a disaster. My aunt was crying, my uncle was drinking heavily and complaining about ungrateful children, and everyone else was sitting in stunned silence. I finished my meal calmly, complimented the food again, and thanked them for a lovely evening. As I was leaving, my aunt pulled me aside. She apologized for my cousin's behavior and asked if there was anything she could do to repair the relationship. I told her I appreciated the apology, but actions had consequences. They'd spent years making me feel unwelcome, and now they were dealing with the results. I drove home to my beautiful house, poured myself a glass of expensive wine, and sat in grandmother's favorite chair. I thought about what she would have said about the evening's events. I think she would have been proud of me for finally standing up for myself. Update 1. The fallout from Easter dinner was swift and brutal. Within a week, half the family was calling me, either to apologize or to ask for money. My uncle wanted a loan to save his business. My aunt thought I should help my cousin get back on his feet. Various relatives suddenly remembered how close we'd always been and suggested I might want to share my good fortune. I turned them all down politely but firmly. I told them I was still learning how to manage my inheritance responsibly, and I wasn't in a position to make any major financial commitments. The truth was, I could have helped them easily, but I wasn't about to reward decades of cruelty with a bailout. My cousin's situation got worse quickly. His wife filed for divorce 2 weeks after Easter, citing financial stress and his inability to handle adversity. She took their daughter and moved back in with her parents. My cousin had to move back in with his parents, sleeping in his childhood bedroom at 35 years old. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd gone from the family charity case to the only one with a stable living situation. I heard through the grapevine that my cousin was telling people I'd stolen his inheritance, that I'd manipulated grandmother into changing her will. But the legal documents were clear, and anyone who knew grandmother understood that she'd made her own decisions. She'd seen how her family treated me, and she'd responded accordingly. 3 months after Easter, my uncle's construction business went under. They lost the family home to foreclosure. My cousin and his parents had to move into a small apartment across town. The golden boy who'd spent years mocking my modest lifestyle was now living in a place smaller than my old apartment. I wish I could say I felt bad about it, but I didn't. They'd made their choices, and now they were living with the consequences. I'd offered them respect and kindness over the years, and they'd thrown it back in my face. Grandmother had seen it all, and she'd made sure justice was served. Update 2. A year later, I was settling into my new life nicely. I'd quit my warehouse job and started a small consulting business, helping other logistics companies optimize their operations. The work was interesting, and I didn't need the money, so I could be selective about my clients. I'd also started dating someone wonderful. She was a teacher I'd met at a coffee shop, and she had no idea about my financial situation when we first started talking. I'd been honest about my inheritance early in our relationship, and she'd been supportive and understanding about the family drama. My cousin, meanwhile, was struggling to rebuild his life. His divorce had been finalized, and he was paying child support he could barely afford. He'd found work with another construction company, but it was entry-level stuff, nothing like the management position he'd had at his father's business. I ran into him at a grocery store one day. He looked tired and defeated, pushing a cart full of generic brands and discount items. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for him. Then I remembered all the times he'd made me feel small, all the jokes at my expense, all the years of casual cruelty. He saw me and froze. We stared at each other for a moment, and I could see him trying to decide whether to approach me or pretend he hadn't seen me. Finally, he walked over. He told me he'd been thinking about what happened at Easter dinner, and he wanted to apologize. He said he'd been under a lot of stress and had taken it out on me unfairly. He admitted that he'd always been jealous of my relationship with grandmother, and he'd let that jealousy turn into resentment. I listened to his apology, and I could tell he was sincere. But sincerity doesn't erase decades of damage. I told him I appreciated his words, but I wasn't ready to forgive and forget. Too much had happened, and trust, once broken, was hard to rebuild. He nodded and said he understood. Then he asked if I might consider helping him get back on his feet, just a small loan to help with his daughter's expenses. He promised he'd pay me back as soon as he could. I looked at him standing there in his worn-out clothes, asking for money from the person he'd spent years calling pathetic. The irony was almost too much to bear. I told him I'd think about it, but we both knew what that meant. I wasn't going to help him, and he wasn't going to ask again. We said goodbye politely, and I watched him walk away, shoulders slumped, pushing his cart of discount groceries. Update 3. 2 years have passed since that Easter dinner, and my life has changed completely. I married my girlfriend in a small ceremony at the house grandmother left me. We're expecting our first child, and I've never been happier. I've used my inheritance wisely, investing most of it and using the returns to fund my business and some charitable causes. I've donated to the local food bank, helped fund a scholarship at the community college I attended, and supported various programs for kids who've lost their parents. My cousin has slowly started to rebuild his life. He's been promoted at his new job, found a small apartment closer to his daughter, and seems to be getting his feet under him. We don't talk, but I hear updates through the family network. The rest of the family has mostly moved on. Some of them still resent me for the inheritance, but they've stopped asking for money. Family gatherings are smaller now, and I'm rarely invited. That's fine with me. I've built my own family, and I don't need their approval anymore. Sometimes I think about what grandmother would say about how everything turned out. I think she'd be proud that I stood up for myself, that I didn't let years of mistreatment define me. She always told me that respect had to be earned, and that people would treat me the way I allowed them to treat me. It took me 32 years to learn that lesson, but I finally did. That Easter dinner was the moment I stopped being the family victim and started being my own person. The inheritance was nice, but the real gift grandmother gave me was the confidence to demand better treatment. My cousin learned that lesson too, just from the other side. He discovered that actions have consequences, that you can't spend years treating someone badly and expect them to help you when you're in trouble. He's working to rebuild his life now, and I respect that, but our relationship will never be what it could have been. The family that spent years making me feel worthless learned that worth isn't determined by money or status. It's determined by how you treat people, especially those who can't fight back. They failed that test, and grandmother made sure they knew it. I'm not the same person who sat quietly through years of insults and humiliation. I'm not the charity case anymore. I'm a successful businessman, a loving husband, and soon to be a father. I'm everything they said I'd never be, and I did it without their help or approval. That Easter dinner was the best revenge I could have asked for. Not because I hurt them, but because I finally showed them who I really was. And grandmother, wherever she is, got the last laugh after all.